I want to give you the opportunity to talk briefly about your book, What on Earth Can We Know About Heaven? And I know that just came out about a year ago, and so I want you to just give a brief introduction of that, I guess, first, and we'll go from there.
It's about heaven and what we can know about it.
I don't know what else I could have expected.
Pretty much nails it. No, it's, I present a thesis in the book, and the thesis is in the form of an equation. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because I talked at the beginning about Stephen Hawking in his book, A Brief History of Time.
Right.
He talks about how his publisher told him, if you put an equation in your book, it's going to half the sales immediately. People are put off by equations. And he said, nonetheless, I still need one equation, that's equals mc squared. And the interesting thing about E equals mc squared, what that equation says is energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. What that means is that energy and matter are not two different things. They are, in fact, the same thing in different states. And using that as a launching point, I offer my own thesis in the book, and that is heaven equals earth multiplied by perfection. A equals EP. And what that means is it contrasts the common assumption which parallels the traditional assumption about matter and energy being fundamentally different. In the same way, Christians, have often assumed that heaven and earth are fundamentally different things.
Right.
You die and you go to heaven off to be with God forever in your immortal soul, and your body goes on the ground. And this world is going to decay and fall apart and pass away. What if, in fact, heaven as an eternal destiny is not something fundamentally different from earth? What if it is, in fact, the redemption of creation? And that's the central idea behind the thesis of the book. That biblically and theologically, if you take a closer look, you find, in fact, that heaven is not fundamentally a new kingdom different from the earth. Heaven, in an eternal sense, represents the redemption, restoration, or resurrection of the creation that God made at the beginning. And I think that idea has some revolutionary consequences.
Yeah, no kidding, because I mean, that's not necessarily what a lot of Christians, per se, would think. I mean, is there something that, like, what caused you to want to write this book? Was there like an event in your life, or was it just something that you had been struggling with, or an issue that had kept coming up that you just, like, what compelled you to feel like it was necessary to put it into a book?
Well, there's been a lot on heaven in recent years. But I think from a theological perspective, a lot of the material that gets published is pretty problematic. I mean, on the one hand, you've got speculative books that try to read Revelation in one hand and the newspaper in the other, right? Sort of some of the dispensational books. And often, they perpetuate this image of the earth being destroyed in flames and fire, and then going up to heaven. And then you also have books that are simply sort of first-hand accounts of I visited heaven, and those tend to end up on the bestseller charts because everybody wants that sort of first-person account of what it's going to be like. For the most part, those are sort of speculative books that seem to have a little grounding in reality. Certainly not much that you can settle by way of evidence. Mm-hmm. So what I wanted was to have something that contributes with makes a more healthy contribution to the dialogue or discussion. Now, I mean, beyond that as well, I think some of the speculative stuff of this traditional view of heaven and earth being fundamentally different, it has a very negative consequence. And the negative consequence is that Christians can become fatalists. We can become, sort of have given up on the world. Mm-hmm. We become quietists, so we're not really socially active in the world. And this is sort of, for me, I see this in an event that happened where I was telling a person once, I just read this, that there was an estimate that by the end of the 21st century, there could be as many as 1 billion climate refugees on Earth. These are people in countries, in particular like Bangladesh, very low-level countries, that are going to be flooded out by global warming, you can't live there anymore because of rising sea levels, because of landslide, because of droughts and other things. So about 1 billion people, at this present population, 1/7 of the Earth's population will be dispossessed of where they presently live. I mean, this to me is extraordinary. Mm. This is a social crisis, slowly coming social crisis of the highest order. That should be on the top level of every Christian's moral agenda. Yeah. This person's response was to say, it's like the world is getting tired out. And I was like, oh! Because what that says is, well, there's nothing we can do. Mm-hmm. God's going to get rid of this world and save us out of it and take us to heaven. reading between the lines, that's really what that person was saying. And so what you have is a particular understanding of heaven that has some pretty serious social consequences, which is basically social inaction. And so part of writing a book on heaven like this is to get people motivated to realize, hey, in the here and now, this is the creation that God isn't going to crumple up and throw into the wastebasket. It's something he wants to and is going to restore. And he's going to come back and see what we, as the images of God in his world, did with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's worthwhile maybe just to take a second to talk about this concept of the image of God. If you go back to Genesis 1, image of God, to be God's image, is like to be the king's image in a foreign land. It's like the representative of the king in the foreign land, like a diplomat. Mm-hmm. And so you're responsible for the king's interests in the foreign land. Well, God, in Christian, biblical, and Jewish Christian theology, God puts us on this planet, in this world, in order to be stewards of it and his representatives. And if he's going to come back and say, how many talents have you multiplied? And he's going to instead see what we've done to the earth, there's going to be some pretty serious consequences. So I think it's important for issues like social action that we get pretty serious about the doctrine of heaven and properly understanding it.
That's a great point, because I think that you're really right when you say that, especially if you're, as a Christian, like you can just get to a point where like, I don't really sure the earth is kind of deteriorating, but that's not my problem. Like, I'm just going to be beamed up here pretty soon, and you guys can deal with that because that's not my problem. And so that's great. I think that's because I know even myself, I've been having to catch myself when I think or say things, and not even specifically about the natural about the earth per se, but even just people, just that you can see troubled people and it's I could help them, but I don't really want to, and because I'm going to go to heaven pretty soon anyway, someone else can deal with that. And so I think that's an awesome point. So I want to, listening to an interview that you had done about this book, you had mentioned about how ancient historical views on heaven have influenced our view on heaven. I think you'd mentioned it already, that we just think it's fully separate from that. And so is there, what can we do as Christians that maybe specific to this topic, but in general, when we're dealing with different topics, that we can separate ourselves from what the ancient people believed historically, and how do we separate ourselves from that the best we can in our modern views?
I think in particular Plato and the ancient Greek philosopher, not the stuff that kids play with in daycare. Plato has been deeply impactful for the way that we think about the afterlife. So the Platonic view is that the soul, this is part of it in terms of anthropology, or theory of human beings. The soul is stuck in the body. The body weighs down the soul, and when the person dies, the soul is free. Mm-hmm. Now, you see this impact in Christian theology throughout history. There's been an endless number of Christian theologians who have said the soul is the nobler part of the human being, the body is sort of secondary. If you go to many Christian funerals still today, you can sit through the funeral and never hear about the resurrection of the body. Instead, all you'll hear about is the fact that this person is now in the presence of Jesus and they're comforted. Maybe you'll hear reference to the immortal soul, but you won't hear very often about the hope of the resurrection of the body. Mm-hmm. And I think stuff like that, it shows the impact of Platonism. Now, there was a bestseller a couple years ago called Proof of Heaven by a liberal Episcopalian neurosurgeon, I think he was a neurosurgeon, named Eben Alexander. And so I read carefully his book, because many Christians were reading it and responding very favorably to it. It's very Platonic in the way that it presents this. He has an out-of-body experience where the soul leaves apart the body, and when the soul is apart from the body, it can think clearly, and he can perceive truths he could never perceive in the body, because the body weighs the soul down and limits your thinking and your reasoning. That is straight out of Plato. So I think in all sorts of ways, the Platonic view of the person still affects us in society. Likewise, then when it comes to thinking about heaven, so you have this, one of the timeless Platonic images is that you're in a cave. And this is the human condition now. We're in a cave, we're chained, and we're facing the inner wall of the cave, and we see these flickering shadows on the wall, and we think that is reality. And what you need to do is to break out of your chains and turn around and look at the light streaming into the cave, projecting those shadows on the wall, and realize that those forms out there and the light is what reality is. And that becomes an image for heaven. For Plato, then, the more that you are turned away from this changing material world, the more focused you are on heaven. And there are many Christians who think in that Platonic way as well. So I like to give an example, kind of from my parents' generation in terms of music. This song, "Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus, Look Full in His Wonderful Face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace." So this idea that the more turned away you are from the world and you are turned on to Jesus, then you're going to be, it's like heaven. And so again, it's a zero-sum game. The more focused you are on heaven, the less you are on the world around you. So I think in all sorts of ways, we continue to be impacted by it. One more example I'll just give is in terms of time. It's very common for Christians to think of heaven as a timeless state. Another old song, "When the roll is called up yonder, and time shall be no more." So this idea is that when heaven begins, time ceases. That is straight out of Plato. Plato believed that this material world, the shadows on the wall, are time and change. If you look away from that to the eternal heaven, then you leave time behind and you just timelessly contemplate God. You know, in what the medievals often called the beatific vision of God. And I think that that's pretty alien, pretty foreign to the way that the Hebrews or the biblical writers would have understood the afterlife. And I think it's something that we would do well to question.
Right, cool. I didn't warn you about this question, but
What's going on?
we were talking when you're talking about the physical body resurrection, and I mean, I think about Jesus, right, and his physical ascension to heaven, and what does that serve as an image to how we should view heaven, and how has it influenced us, and how should it influence us, I guess, if that's an appropriate question to ask, is that?
Well, it is interesting that the Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15:20, he describes the resurrection body of Jesus as the first fruits of resurrection. So it's the first fruits of what our future resurrection is going to be like. So if you think about that illustration of a new crop of fruit, this is like the resurrection body of Jesus is like getting the first bit of the crop in January, and then the rest is going to come in July.
Right.
And that rest is us. So then that gives you a picture, a snapshot as to what the coming crop is going to be like. Well, so then his resurrection body, what did he do? Well, you could touch it. It was physical. You could put your hand in his side. He sat on the beach and ate fish. So he was a fully physical being. He even says, "Come, it is me. It is not a ghost." He's going to be fully physical. He's not less than physical. Mm-hmm. If anything, he's more than physical, but he's certainly not less than physical.
Right.
Now, in the ascension, what that represents is Jesus doesn't leave his body behind. What rises to the presence of God physically. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind that the physical ascension to heaven that Jesus does in the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts, as I would understand that, I still think it's a historical event, but I also think it's an accommodation to ancient peoples who physically thought of heaven as being above.
Right.
And so that's why Jesus goes above. That's the way of him communicating, I bring my physical presence now to the presence of God. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what that would have looked like today. If Jesus were come today and then were to go back to God's presence, I don't know what he would look like today. But I do know that what that says is he continues to be physical.
Right.
And so in 1 Timothy 2, we read that we have one mediator between God and men, the man, Christ Jesus. He continues to be a physical human being. Mm-hmm. And again, that just shows us that for our future resurrection bodies, they will likewise be physical bodies. And not just replacement bodies. This is another thing to keep in mind. Jesus' resurrection body left the tomb empty.
Right.
So it was the same body that was crucified was resurrected. And there were markers in his hands and side to make the point. Likewise, we will be resurrected with our same bodies. That's important to keep in mind because you have some places like in 2 Corinthians 5 where Paul contrasts the present tent that we live in with our future eternal dwelling. And you could read that to think that those are two different bodies. But if you read that within the totality of Scripture, you can see that really the point he's making is there's going to be one body that becomes eternal.
Right. Cool. Because, I think that's a really interesting point that, even for myself, I haven't often thought about. Because, that's what Jesus represents as part of the Trinity, is that he was and is fully man. And I think that we'll think, well, but he was a man, and now he's just kind of in heaven like God, and it's different. But I think that's a really interesting point that I know for myself is something important to just keep in mind and to remember, because, yeah, I think that's, in my own experience, I've noticed that we often think that heaven, whatever it is just purely spiritual, and there's nothing.
We kind of, I'm surprised how many Christians think about the incarnation as something akin to a short-term mission. You know, that Jesus kind of, for a few weeks, he went over and identified with human beings, and then he went back to his, existence in his first world with God the Father in the heavenly mansion. In fact, what Christians posit is that Christ went native in the sense that he really identified fully with these people. He's not going back on furlough. He's not going to retire and go back to his original sending country. He's eternally identified with the human condition. And that's a pretty radical claim, but that's the claim that Christians make about the incarnation.
Yeah, interesting. That's awesome. Well, I don't have any more questions. If you have any more comments about anything, but I mean specifically about your book.
Anything at all?
Anything. If you had to choose.
Well, I do think that, I would just say that, to come back to a point I began with, that I don't think heaven is just a doctrine for the afterlife. I think it is a doctrine that should transform the way we live now. Now, one other thing I would just add, there is also that existential dimension to it. And that is that when you think about the doctrine of heaven, really in an eternal perspective, you don't have to fear death. I think a lot of people, they go through life with various modes of trying to avoid the reality of death and put it out of mind. If we recognize that this life now is but the forecourt for eternity, then that should take off the fear of death as well. So there's a real comfort in the doctrine, but also that it should transform the way we live now. It's not an abstract doctrine. It's not precious moments knickknacks. It's not Philadelphia cream cheese commercials, if you remember those. It's simply something that is a really radical sense of God's purposes to redeem that which he makes.
Awesome.